The final of the government's economic goals is the goal of equity in income distribution, or the goal of equity in the distribution of income. Now, on this matter, the government pursues the goal of equity in income distribution because it wants a fair and equitable spread of the income earned in the country. And now, this relates to the achievement of two goals, two things that the goal of equity in income distribution can be split up to. Okay, so by definition, it is where everyone should have access to a reasonable standard of living. I'm going to highlight this because that is one of the major goals that the government aims to achieve, is where everyone should have an access to a reasonable standard of living and avoid poverty. I'm going to highlight that as well. So this goal is arguably one of the least concerned by the government, because what defines reasonable is of course very subjective. So what is reasonable can change between many people. But in most cases it is just the avoidance of poverty. So the needs of people are met. So it relates back to this idea of needs are met. Of course, we cannot meet all the wants of people because of our limited or scarce resources, but the government aims to achieve a reasonable standard of living for all of its people, where the needs to survive are met. So that includes shelter, food, clothing, education, water, and all those basic needs for human survival. Now, poverty can relate to two different concepts. One which is absolute poverty, and another which is relative poverty. Now, the government, in this goal of equity in the distribution of income, tries to eliminate absolute poverty here, and doesn't really, or accepts that relative poverty will always exist in the community. So we're going to look at the definition of both. We're going to asterisk the absolute white and the relative in blue. Okay, so we're going to look at these definitions here. What is absolute poverty? Now, absolute poverty is what the word actually suggests. It is absolute. It is absolute. So what this means is that needs or basic survival measures are not met. So say people in communities, they don't have clean water to drink, they don't have sufficient clothes or food for a standard of living that is reasonable, as defined by the goal of equity and distribution of income. It's where our needs or basic survival measures are not met. So let me put this example as not enough food / water, not enough clothes / shelter. And this is very prevalent in African communities around the world. That's absolute poverty, and the government aims to eliminate all absolute poverty. Now, on the other hand, we have what is called relative poverty, and that's where we are relatively worse off compared to the community. So our living standards of certain people do not match the living standards of people around them. So that may mean that their incomes aren't as high as, say, people in the community or their friends. So for example, although you can meet a reasonable standard of living here, we don't have all our wants met, and this relates to this idea of want. So say, for example, you live in a very wealthy area. You are relatively you experience relative poverty you say you don't have a car, for example, where all your friends and all the community around you have cars to travel with. So that's the idea of relative poverty, and the government accepts that relative poverty cannot be eliminated because of this equity versus efficiency argument. I'm just going to note here, equity versus efficiency. Because if everyone has the same thing, if everyone can obtain the same needs and wants, then there's no incentive. There are no incentive to actually improve living standards because there's no differentiating factor between two households. And so that's why relative poverty may always exist in the community. So that's the goal of the equity in income distribution in Australia, is when everyone should have an access to a reasonable standard of living and to avoid absolute poverty here rather than relative poverty.